Elon Musk sat unnoticed in a Kiwi cafe until local voices forced him to rethink everything. Elon Musk walked into the daily grind in Ponsonby, Auckland, on a grey winter morning that felt like every other Tuesday in July. The rain had been falling steadily since dawn, creating that particular Auckland atmosphere where the harbour disappears into mist and the Sky Tower becomes a ghostly silhouette against pewter clouds. He wore a faded all-blacks jersey, the kind you'd find in any op shop from Kaitaia to Invercargill, old jeans with paint stains that suggested weekend DIY projects, and a black beanie pulled low over his eyes. No one looked twice. In New Zealand, billionaires dress like everyone else, and everyone else dresses like they're heading to the bark for the weekend. There's something beautifully equalizing about a country where the Prime Minister shops at Countdown and the richest person on the planet can disappear into a crowd wearing rugby merch. The cafe smelled of flat whites and fresh lamingtons, that distinctly Kiwi combination of serious coffee culture and unapologetic comfort food. Rain streaked the large windows overlooking the harbour, where Fuller's ferries cut through choppy waters toward Waiheke Island, their wake creating V-shaped patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Elon ordered a long black, no sugar, no milk, just the way they make it strong enough to wake the dead in South Island mining towns, and found a corner table near the window. The barista, a young woman with intricate tar moco peeking from beneath her sleeve, handed him the coffee without recognition. Just another tired-looking bloke seeking caffeine salvation on a Wellington grey morning. He'd been in Auckland for 3 days, supposedly for a SpaceX meeting at the University of Auckland's Aerospace Department. The official story involved discussions about launching small satellites for New Zealand's agricultural monitoring systems. But really, he was hiding. The previous week, a tweet he'd posted about solving world hunger with innovative technology had backfired spectacularly. The responses weren't the usual mix of praise and trolling. They were different. Raw. Personal. Comments flooded in from people struggling to pay rent in Auckland's housing crisis, where a basic 3-bedroom home now costs more than luxury apartments in most global cities. Maori communities still fighting for basic infrastructure after decades of systemic neglect. Families choosing between groceries and power bills as the cost of living spiraled beyond reach of minimum wage workers. Easy to talk about Mars when you've never lived on Struggle Street, one comment read, liked by thousands. My kids eat toast for dinner 3 nights a week, so we can keep the heating on. Where's my innovative solution, wrote another. Come live in South Auckland for a month on a beneficiary's income, then talk to us about solving hunger, said a third. The words had hit him like a Canterbury nor'wester, unexpected, brutal, and impossible to ignore. At the table next to him, 3 people huddled over laptops and coffee cups stained with ring marks from countless refills. Their conversation drew him in despite his intention to remain invisible. The waiting list for public housing in South Auckland is 18 months now, said Aroha, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that held the weight of seeing too much, and hands calloused from years of community work. 18 months for a family to get a dry, warm home. Meanwhile, we've got empty houses sitting as investment properties throughout the city. She wore a well-worn jersey from the Warriors rugby league team and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who'd spent years explaining complex social problems to people who had the power to fix them, but rarely the will. My app could fix that, whispered James, a young Samoan developer whose laptop screen showed lines of code interspersed with architectural drawings. I've built a platform that matches empty rooms, granny flats, and transitional housing with families in genuine need. Real-time availability, community verification systems, cultural compatibility matching. His voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a solution, but lacked the resources to implement it properly. The kind of frustration that keeps developers awake at night, knowing they could change lives if only someone would listen. "Good luck with that, bro," said Pete, an older Pākehā man stirring sugar into his coffee with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd learned patience the hard way. Been trying to get investors interested in community-focused tech for 5 years. They only care about apps that help rich people buy more stuff they don't need, or platforms that extract data from users to sell to advertisers. His tone held the weariness of someone who'd pitched brilliant ideas to rooms full of suits who couldn't see past the next quarterly profit margin. Aroha sighed, the sound carrying 15 years of bureaucratic battles and small victories that never felt quite enough. "I've been working with Housing New Zealand, Kainga Ora, community housing providers. The system isn't broken, exactly. It's just not built for real people with real lives. We need solutions that understand our communities, our whakapapa, our actual needs." Elon found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into their conversation like metal filings to a magnet. These weren't abstract problems from his Twitter feed or sanitized case studies from consulting reports. These were people trying to solve the same challenges he claimed to care about, but with budgets smaller than his daily lunch expenses, and a depth of understanding he was beginning to realize he'd never possessed. James pulled up his app on the laptop, tilting the screen so the others could see. "Look, the interface is simple but the back end is sophisticated. Families upload their needs, location preferences, family size, timeline, accessibility requirements. Homeowners with spare rooms, granny flats, or transitional properties can offer space. The algorithm matches based on proximity to schools, work, transport links, and this is the crucial part, whakapapa connections." "That's brilliant," Aroha said, genuine excitement replacing her earlier weariness. "But how do you handle trust verification? Safety checks? Cultural considerations that Housing New Zealand always seems to miss." "That's the thing I'm most proud of," James continued, his voice gaining confidence. "The app includes Wakatohia features, ways for communities to vouch for each other through traditional networks. Maori and Pacific families often have extended support systems that official housing algorithms completely ignore. My grandmother's cousin's neighbor might be the perfect landlord for my family, but that connection is invisible to government databases." Pete leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "My daughter's been on the waiting list for 2 years. She's got 2 kids under 5, works 2 jobs, one cleaning offices in the CBD at night, another at a rest home during the day, and still can't afford Auckland rents. This could actually help her instead of just adding her to another bureaucratic queue." His voice cracked slightly on the word daughter, and Elon felt something shift inside his chest. A recognition that behind every housing statistic was someone's child, someone's grandchild, someone's hope for a better future. Over the next hour, he listened to more conversations that painted a picture of innovation happening without venture capital, without media coverage, without him. Sarah, a teacher from a rural school in Northland, talked about her project bringing coding classes to isolated farming communities. Her laptop showed video calls with kids learning programming through stories about native birds and sustainable farming practices. The project was hampered by internet connections that dropped out every time the wind blew, infrastructure that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. "We are teaching these kids to build apps that could revolutionize agriculture," she explained to her companion, another teacher named David. "But when they try to upload their projects, the internet crawls slower than a glacial advance." Meanwhile, the government talks about digital inclusion while rural communities get left further and further behind. Mike, a farmer whose weathered face spoke of decades working Waikato dairy land, discussed his sustainable agriculture initiative with quiet passion. His notebook, coffee-stained and filled with hand-drawn diagrams, outlined systems that could feed Auckland's growing population while regenerating soil health and reducing carbon emissions. The technology exists, he said, sketching irrigation patterns on a napkin. Precision agriculture, soil sensors, automated systems that use a third of the water and produce twice the yield. But the distribution networks are controlled by the same companies that profit from the old ways. Small innovative farms can't access the markets that would make sustainable farming profitable. An artist named Lily described her community centre in Otara, a converted warehouse that provided art therapy for at-risk youth, job training programs, and cultural preservation workshops. Her phone showed photos of teenagers creating murals that told stories of their heritage, their struggles, their dreams. "We need $40,000 to keep the doors open for another year," she said simply. "That's less than some people spend on a car." But grant applications take months, and by the time we get approval, kids have already given up hope. Meanwhile, politicians talk about youth crime without ever asking what these kids actually need. Real solutions. Real people. Real impact happening in the shadows while the world's attention focused on rockets and electric cars and social media drama. That afternoon, Elon walked along Takapuna Beach, watching waves crash against volcanic sand that had been shaped by forces older than human civilization. The Auckland Harbour Bridge stretched across grey waters, its arc a testament to human engineering and ambition. But all he could think about were the voices from the cafe. James's housing app, Aroha's 15 years of frontline experience, Sarah's rural students learning to code by candlelight when the power went out. His phone buzzed constantly with the usual stream of notifications. Tesla stock prices, SpaceX launch schedules, meeting requests about the next revolutionary breakthrough, media interviews where journalists would ask him to predict the future while ignoring the present. But the future he'd been imagining suddenly felt disconnected from the reality he'd witnessed that morning. What good was a colony on Mars if families on Earth couldn't find homes? What was the point of global internet if rural teachers couldn't access it? How could he claim to be advancing human civilization while remaining ignorant of the most basic human struggles? The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in that particular golden light that makes Auckland look like a city from a tourism commercial. But Elon felt like he was seeing it clearly for the first time, not as a backdrop for his next venture, but as a place where real people lived real lives with real problems that required real solutions. The next morning, he returned to the daily grind. Same corner table, same long black coffee, same beanie pulled low over eyes that now felt more observant than hidden. The cafe buzzed with the energy of a Wednesday morning, commuters grabbing flat whites before catching ferries to the city, students hunched over textbooks and laptops, elderly couples sharing newspapers, and comfortable silences. The rain had returned, creating a cocoon of warmth and caffeine-scented air that felt separate from the rushing world outside. When Aroha, James, and Pete sat down at their usual table, laptops and notebooks spreading across the surface like familiar friends, Elon felt his heart rate increase. For someone who'd given presentations to world leaders and addressed crowds of thousands, the prospect of interrupting a conversation between three strangers felt terrifying. He waited until there was a natural pause in their discussion, then cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help overhearing yesterday. That app you're building, it sounds incredible." James looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. New Zealanders have a natural openness to strangers, a cultural assumption that anyone willing to start a conversation probably has something worth hearing. "Oh, thanks mate. You're into tech. You could say that." Elon hesitated, then slowly pulled off his beanie, running a hand through hair that was unmistakably recognizable to anyone who'd seen a newspaper or social media feed in the past decade. I'm Elon Musk. The silence that followed stretched like a taut fishing line, filled with the ambient sounds of the cafe, espresso machines hissing, conversations at other tables, rain pattering against windows. But their table had become an island of stunned quiet. Yeah, right, Pete laughed, but his laughter died as he looked more closely at the face across from him. And I'm Richie McCaw. Elon pulled out his phone, showing them his verified Twitter account with its distinctive blue checkmark, photos of him with world leaders, SpaceX footage he'd posted just days earlier. The evidence was undeniable, but the context was so unexpected that acceptance came slowly. Aroha's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, her eyes widening with recognition not just of his face, but of the implications of his presence. "What are you doing in Ponsonby?" James whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had brought one of the world's most famous entrepreneurs to their corner table in an Auckland cafe. "Learning," Elon said simply, and the honesty in that single word seemed to shift something in the atmosphere around them. "I've been talking about solving problems I don't actually understand. You three know more about real solutions than most of my board meetings have ever produced." What happened next wasn't a typical Silicon Valley fairy tale of instant funding and overnight scaling. It wasn't a story that would make headlines about disruptive innovation or revolutionary technology. Instead, it was something more radical, a conversation. Elon didn't pull out his checkbook or start making phone calls to his assistants. Instead, he asked questions. Real questions. The kind that required him to admit ignorance rather than display expertise. How do Pacific Island families prefer to communicate about housing needs, and why might they distrust official platforms? What makes a Maori community accept or reject new technology, and how do you build systems that honor whakapapa while embracing innovation? What are the cultural protocols around offering and accepting help, and how do you design algorithms that respect those boundaries? James found himself explaining not just the technical aspects of his app, but the cultural research that had shaped every interface decision. How the color scheme reflected traditional Pacific patterns, how the verification system incorporated concepts of collective responsibility, how the matching algorithm weighted community connections alongside practical considerations. Aroha shared stories from 15 years of community work, families who'd been failed by systems designed by people who'd never experienced housing insecurity, bureaucratic processes that treated housing as a commodity rather than a human right, innovative solutions that had emerged from communities themselves, but never received recognition or scaling support. Pete talked about watching his daughter's dreams shrink as housing costs expanded, about working multiple jobs that left no time for family while struggling to afford family life, about the grinding daily calculation of whether rent or groceries or heating took priority each week. The conversation lasted 4 hours. 4 hours during which one of the world's most powerful people sat in a cafe learning about problems he'd never personally experienced from people whose solutions he'd never thought to seek. By the end, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in Elon's understanding, but in the dynamic between innovation and community, between global resources and local wisdom, between technological possibility and human reality. James's housing app became the foundation for a new Tesla initiative, but not in the way anyone might have predicted. Instead of just funding the app, Tesla created an entire sustainable community development division. The housing platform incorporated Tikanga Maori principles of collective responsibility, Pacific Island concepts of extended family networks, and rural New Zealand values of practical self-reliance. But more than that, it became a model for how technology companies could partner with communities rather than simply serving them. The algorithm was designed not by Silicon Valley engineers, but by a team that included James, Aroha, and community representatives from across New Zealand. The beta testing happened in actual neighborhoods with real families, and the feedback shaped every subsequent iteration. Aroha joined Tesla as Director of Community Partnerships, bringing her 15 years of grassroots experience to scale solutions that actually worked for real families rather than just looking good in presentations. Her first initiative was a requirement that every Tesla employee working on community-focused projects spend at least 1 month living and working within the communities they were trying to serve. Sarah's rural education project received not just Starlink internet access, but a completely redesigned coding curriculum created specifically for New Zealand schools. The programming lessons incorporated local legends and environmental challenges, teaching kids to build apps that addressed real problems in their own communities. Students learned to code by creating solutions for local farmers, designing systems to monitor native bird populations, and building platforms that connected rural communities with urban resources. Mike's sustainable farming initiative connected with Tesla's energy storage systems, but again, not in the conventional way. Instead of imposing technology on existing farming practices, the collaboration started with understanding what farmers actually needed. The result was a network of regenerative agriculture systems that provided food security for urban populations while improving soil health and creating climate resilience. The program started with 5 farms in the Waikato and expanded to include permaculture projects in Northland, organic orchards in central Otago, and sustainable fishing cooperatives in the Bay of Islands. Each location adapted the technology to local conditions and cultural practices, creating a model that could be replicated globally while respecting local knowledge. But perhaps the most significant change was in Elon himself, and by extension, in how his companies approached innovation. He established community coffee hours across all his companies, not just Tesla, but SpaceX, Neuralink, and his other ventures. These weren't public relations exercises or token consultation sessions. They were mandatory days when executives had to work alongside frontline employees, when billion-dollar decisions were made with wisdom learned from baristas and farmers and teachers and community workers. The policy required that no major product launch could proceed without community input from the populations it would affect. Engineers who designed satellite internet systems had to spend time in rural schools experiencing connectivity challenges firsthand. Software developers creating financial platforms had to work with families managing housing insecurity. Managers making strategic decisions had to understand not just market analysis, but human impact. Twitter, now X, launched Voices of Aotearoa, a New Zealand-specific initiative that gave local stories the same algorithmic weight as celebrity posts. The platform prioritized content from community organizations, rural schools, sustainable farming projects, and Indigenous rights advocates. Suddenly, Sarah's students could share their coding projects with the same reach as international tech influencers, and Mike's farming innovations received the same visibility as startup funding announcements. SpaceX began an Earth-focused program specifically addressing climate and infrastructure challenges facing island nations and rural communities. Instead of just launching satellites for global internet coverage, the program partnered with local communities to understand their specific needs. Satellite monitoring systems were designed to help farmers optimize water usage, track illegal fishing in marine reserves, and provide early warning systems for natural disasters. The most revolutionary aspect wasn't the technology itself, but the process. Communities weren't just users of the systems, but partners in their design and implementation. A year later, Elon returned to the daily grind, this time without any disguise at all. He walked in wearing the same faded All Blacks jersey, but now it felt like a choice rather than a costume. The cafe had transformed, but not in the way gentrification typically changes neighborhoods. The transformation was deeper, more organic. Aroha's community housing organization occupied the renovated loft space upstairs, providing not just office space, but a community hub where families could access housing support, legal advice, and cultural programs. James's app had connected over 3,000 families with safe, affordable housing across New Zealand. But more importantly, it had spawned a network of community-led housing initiatives that operated on principles of mutual aid rather than market profit. Housing cooperatives, collective ownership models, and intergenerational living arrangements that honored both practical needs and cultural values. Sarah's rural education program had reached every region from Northland to Southland, with coding classes now integrated into the standard curriculum for rural schools. Her students were creating apps that solved real local problems, systems for tracking predator-free wildlife reserves, platforms connecting rural youth with urban mentorship programs, and games that taught traditional Maori legends through interactive storytelling. Mike's sustainable farming network had grown to include over 200 properties across both islands, creating food security systems that were both economically viable and environmentally regenerative. The network supplied 30% of Auckland's fresh produce through direct community-supported agriculture relationships that connected urban families with rural producers. Pete's daughter had found not just housing through James's app, but a pathway to a completely different future. She was now studying software development at AUT, part of a scholarship program created specifically for parents transitioning out of housing insecurity. Her final project was an app that helped single parents navigate the complex web of government support services, community resources, and educational opportunities. "You know what's beautiful about all this?" Aroha said, as late afternoon winter light filtered through those same rain-streaked windows, casting everything in shades of gold and grey that felt quintessentially Auckland. "This story isn't about you going undercover to discover how the other half lives. It's about finally being discovered yourself." "Discovered?" Elon asked, though he suspected he understood what she meant. Who you really were underneath all those headlines and stock prices and Twitter controversies. Just someone who wanted to help, but had forgotten how to listen with your heart instead of your head. She paused, watching the rain create patterns on the glass that resembled the intricate designs of traditional weaving. "The thing about Manaca, our concept of caring for others, is that it's reciprocal. You can't just give help. You have to be willing to receive it. To learn. To admit that the people you're trying to help might actually know more about solutions than you do." The world's richest man had learned the most valuable lesson possible. Success isn't about reaching Mars, or achieving technological breakthroughs, or accumulating wealth. It's about lifting everyone up along the journey, and recognizing that the journey itself is more important than any destination. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply sitting down and letting the world teach you something new. In New Zealand, they call it Manaca, the art of caring for others as if they were your own family, but also allowing others to care for you. The rain continued to fall on Auckland, as it had for countless generations before smartphones and satellites and electric cars. But inside the daily grind, something had changed that would ripple outward in ways that no algorithm could predict and no market analysis could measure. Real change, it turned out, didn't start with revolutionary technology or billion-dollar investments. It started with recognizing that the people closest to problems are also closest to solutions, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a powerful person can do is simply listen. Would you recognize greatness disguised in an old All Blacks jersey? Or are we all just waiting for someone, anyone, to finally listen to our story and understand that we might just have the answers the world desperately needs? underscore 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 underscore. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something real break open inside you, or if you recognized yourself in someone's quiet struggle against systems that weren't built for real people with real lives, help us keep telling stories like this. A simple gesture, a click on like, a decision to share, a choice to subscribe, makes all the difference for our little channel trying to amplify voices that usually go unheard. Leave a comment about what moved you, or what story from your own community you'd like to hear told next time. Because every neighborhood has its own James and Aroha and Sarah, its own solutions waiting for someone to listen. Thank you for being here, for caring about the stories that matter, for believing that change is possible when we start by changing how we listen. With warm regards from a rain-soaked cafe in Auckland, Luca Macken.